Finally, let's take our Bibles, if you would please turn to Acts chapter number 10. And we're continuing looking at the words here we find in our Bible that are written in red. The Lord here has already been crucified. He's back in heaven. But he's still sending messages down to earth, and he's wanting to convey what he feels at that present time are very, very important things. As we come upon this situation, I know that you're pretty familiar with it, but by the same token, I think that we need to be careful that we don't miss something that is tucked away here that I believe is very, very crucial and important. Acts chapter 10, beginning at verse number 1, the Bible there says, "There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band, a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. He saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. And now send men to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodgeth with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do. And when the angel which spake unto Cornelius was departed, he called two of his household servants, and a devout soldier of them that waited on him continually. And when he had declared all these things unto them, he sent them to Joppa. On the morrow, as they went on their journey and drew nigh unto the city, Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour. And he became very hungry and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven open and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the four corners and let down to the earth, wherein were all manner of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts and creeping things and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. I want to bring a message this morning on the subject of the lost message. World War II was coming to an end. Lieutenant Anata was assigned to an island in the Philippines, and he was supposed to create as much havoc for the Americans as he possibly could. He was a Japanese soldier, a military intelligence individual, and his job was to perform guerrilla activities so as to create a nuisance for the Americans. And above all, his ultimate order was he was to never surrender. Attached to that, he was never allowed to kill himself. As the fighting worsened, the Americans were closing in, and his entire unit had been reduced to just himself and 3 other Japanese soldiers. And that's when Lieutenant Onata gave the instructions to head to the hills, and we'll meet up at a later time. They did so, and they were able to hide out in the hills for a while. And then after about a month, something very, very strange took place. An American airplane flew over, dropped out a bunch of pieces of paper. And they found one of these leaflets, and this leaflet said, The war is over. Please surrender. The war is over. Lieutenant Anata and his men read this. They came to the conclusion, obviously, it's a trick by those sneaky Americans, and they continued their guerrilla activities. They found more leaflets over a period of time, and the Japanese soldiers came to the same conclusion over and over again. All of this stuff is nothing but a trick. After about a year, one of these Japanese soldiers decided that he'd been hiding out long enough. He decided to surrender. A short time after that, another one of the soldiers was shot in the leg by a farmer. A couple of years after that, one of them was killed by a search party. Over the years, Lieutenant Onata was the last one left alive, and he continued to burn crops, kill livestock, and evade being captured. Finally, in 1974, a Japanese hippie arrived on the island, and this Japanese hippie had 3 lifetime goals. This was his bucket list. The first one was to find Lieutenant Onata. People knew who he was. They had heard of him. The second thing, he wanted to see a panda in the wild. And the third thing, he wanted to find the abominable snowman. He finally found Lieutenant Onoda, which was first on the list, and they became friends. And he tried to convince this soldier. He said, you know, the war's been over for almost 30 years. You need to give it up. You need to surrender. But Lieutenant Onoda told him he could not do so because he had not been properly relieved. He had not received any further orders. The hippie then went back, contacted Japanese officials. They located the officer that had given him those original orders, and they flew him to the Philippines, took him to the island, and there was an official ceremony where Lieutenant Onoda was finally relieved of his post. When he returned to Japan and people found out the details, he was welcomed as a hero. As we come to this chapter, we are shown a message from the Lord that was designed to convey some things. But the message, while it's understood properly in a couple of different areas, the whole context seems to be lost. As far as when people read it, they sometimes are not able to connect the dot. The first message that the Lord was trying to convey was the fact that the ceremonial part of the law had been done away with. When Peter saw in a vision this great big sheet coming down out of the sky, there were all sorts of creepy, crawly things inside, and he was told something incredible, and that was he was supposed to kill them and then eat them. And Peter couldn't believe it. All of his Jewish life, he had been indoctrinated as to what he was allowed to eat, things which were kosher, and things that he was not allowed to eat, like pork. Yeah. Aren't you glad that you were not a Jew in those days? Couldn't believe it. When he first heard this, it had to be a mistake. Obviously, this can't be true. There's no way in the world that I'm going to eat a barbecue pulled pork sandwich and think that God is allowing me to do so. That's when he was told, what God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. And still wrestling in his mind, I'm sure he's asking, how could this be? It is called the New Testament. Amen. It was a difficult thing to grasp for Peter and the others. And yet the Lord was setting aside Judaism as being a dead religion, and he was replacing it with something brand new that was called Christianity. And therefore the ceremonial part of the law was suspended. Pulled pork sandwiches are now okay. Amen. Old Testament sacrifices were now no longer required. God was doing something entirely new, and Jews were now permitted to eat things that once had been forbidden. As Peter was trying to pick himself up off the floor from this incredible message that he had been given, then he was hit with another one. And it was even more incredible. He was told to go to the city of Caesarea. It was a city named after Caesar. It was a military outpost. The place was rife. It was filled with Roman soldiers. And not only did he have to go there, but he had to go and meet with a Roman centurion. It was bad enough that Peter was having to meet a Roman, let alone a soldier on top of that. I mean, these are the guys that had just crucified the Lord, and now he's got to go talk with one? As Peter met with Cornelius, the Lord's second message began to sink in. And it was even more incredible than he could now have pulled pork sandwiches. And the message was, there was now no longer a distinction between Jew and Gentile. In Acts chapter 10, verse 34, then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. Now the right words are coming out, and he's speaking through inspiration, but I think his mind and heart was still having a hard time catching up. He's probably having to pinch himself. Did I really see a vision? Am I really hearing this thing right? I really have to go talk to this centurion, and now there's no difference between Jew or Gentile when Jews have always been considered as being God's chosen people. Even those two messages were startling. They practically blew Peter away, but there was one message that is found in this whole thing that most people just don't see. It is a message that most of the world will not accept. And it has to do not with Peter, but with Cornelius. I want you to notice how many things in the context or the background of this message by the Lord, how many things the Bible is sharing about this individual, a Roman centurion by the name of Cornelius. Look at verse number 1. The first thing that we are being informed about is the fact that he was willing to be different. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of a band called the Italian band. A Roman legion was comprised of 6,800 soldiers. A band was 1/10 of that, meaning that Cornelius was in charge of 680 men. He was the officer in charge. He was their boss. He had an enormous amount of influence over these Roman soldiers, and yet, even though he was a career officer, even though he was wanting to be promoted as he served Caesar, he was different than any other Roman officer these men had ever served under. You see, Cornelius prayed over his meals. Cornelius never used profanity. Cornelius didn't worship any Roman god, nor did Cornelius treat the Jews as if they were animals or second-class citizens. In fact, he acted just like that man back in Jerusalem who was crucified. His name was Jesus. And this individual stood out big time in the Roman army, for he had chosen to be different. Something else that we're told through inspiration is the fact that he was spiritually minded. Look at verse number 2. And certainly if you want the word devout, it says a devout man, one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people, and prayed to God always. The word devout means to be reverential. It means to be spiritually minded. Now, when a person is worldly or when they're carnal, their every thought is about themselves. They are constantly thinking about things that make them feel better, or things that'll cause them to look better. They become overly self-indulgent. They're driven by nothing but selfishness. Their motto is, me first. And that's how the world is. That's how the Romans were. But not Cornelius. A spiritually minded person is constantly thinking about the Lord and how to please Him. And the Bible tells us he was a devout man. He didn't care what other Roman soldiers did, but he was very concerned about how God looked upon his life. And for that reason, he was always very careful as to how he spoke, where he went, and how he carried himself. That, as a Roman officer, he served Caesar as a loyal Roman soldier was expected to do. But in his mind was always the thinking about the God of heaven. Again, in verse number 2, if you want to circle the matter that he feared God, he was a God-fearing individual. And again, keep in mind, this is a description that is being given by the Holy Spirit Himself. He was God-fearing. Now, what exactly does it mean to fear God? It is obviously a healthy kind of fear. A matter of fearing doing wrong and being punished for it, obviously, but it's more than that. When a criminal comes before a judge, and that criminal knows that the judge can throw the book at them and send them away for a very, very long time, there would naturally be a fear of that judge. But when that same criminal is the son of that judge, he knows that he has not just broken the law, but he's also broken his father's heart. That is a different kind of fear. There is the fear that Dad will never forgive him. for what he has done. Cornelius was a man who knew that God was holy. He knew that God would not tolerate the wickedness that was rampant in the Roman army. But his fearing God was more than that. It was different. Cornelius did not view God as another Caesar who was cruel or unkind, depending on what mood he was in or how the winds blew. He viewed God as more of a father who expected much. But Cornelius loved him in a way that was driven by that right kind of fear of God. And he feared not just the punishment, but he also feared disappointing God as well. In verse number 2 again, we find that he was a man of generosity. He was a devout man and one that feared God with all his house, and which gave much alms to the people. Jews were used to seeing Roman soldiers stealing from them. They were used to soldiers forcing them to carry their knapsack, their equipment. Legally, they could force them to carry it up to a mile, and the Lord was encouraging them to carry it voluntarily a second mile and do it with a smile. They were used to these foreigners taking anything and everything that they wanted. But Cornelius not only refused to behave like the rest of the Romans, but he actually gave money to the poor. In fact, he gave so much so often that he made many of the Jews feel bad because he was more generous than they were. But he didn't hate and despise the Jews. In fact, it seemed that he was more Jewish than many of the Jews were. And whenever he saw a Jew who was begging or was handicapped by blindness or a disease, it seemed that he would go out of his way to help that poor person. But unlike the Pharisees, he wasn't trying to make a spectacle of himself. He was giving from the heart with the intent of being pleasing to the Lord. In verse 2 again, we're told that he was a man of prayer, for he was a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, and which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. Cornelius did not fit the portrait of a Roman soldier. Other soldiers were chasing women or getting drunk. Other soldiers were cursing the Jews, beating them at will, or robbing them if they chose to. But Cornelius didn't treat the Jews with anything but kindness and compassion. And then when he was all alone, he prayed. He prayed for the little things as well as the big things. He prayed over his food as well as those who were sick under his charge. And for those who may have heard him pray, he prayed as if his invisible God could really hear him. In verse number 3, we're told something else, and that is the fact that he was a man who made an impression on God. He saw in a vision, evidently about the 9th hour of the day, an angel of God coming into him and saying unto him, Cornelius. And when he looked on him, he was afraid and said, What is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Thy prayers and thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. A memorial. How many times have you done something that was so sweet and so special to God that you could imagine that he took those things and set them aside just so that he could admire what you had done for him? That's what Cornelius had done. His prayers, his giving were both taken by God and set aside as a memorial so that God could look upon him and the deeds that he had done for God. The reason was he was really making an impression on God. In verse number 5, the Holy Spirit also shares with us the fact that he was a man of obedience. And now send men to Joppa and call for one Simon, whose surname is Peter. He lodgeth with one Simon a tanner, whose house is by the seaside. He shall tell thee what thou oughtest to do. When Cornelius received this vision and was told to send men to Joppa, he did immediately that very thing that he had been told. They were told exactly where to go. They were told exactly what to do. They were told who to find. And they were instructed to bring Peter back to Caesarea, to Cornelius' house. And it has to be done immediately. And when Cornelius heard this, there was no hesitation. Amen. There was no reservation. There were no excuses. There was no, this isn't a good time, or maybe we can do this next week. Cornelius was a man who obeyed every order that was given to him. The fact that it now came in a vision made it all the more important to obey. Take a look at Acts 10, verse 24. Something else that we're informed of is the fact that he was a man with a burden for others. And the morrow, after they entered into Caesarea, and Cornelius waited for them and had called together his kinsmen and near friends. When Cornelius knew that the Apostle Peter was on his way to his house, he was beside himself with joy. He probably already knew that Peter was one of the Lord's disciples and had spent 3 years with him. He was probably hoping to hear some of the stories, the eyewitness accounts that Peter would be able to give, the sermons that he heard the Lord preach, the miracles that he saw the Lord do. And he could share things with Cornelius about Jesus Christ that others would never have known. And yet Peter was there for 3 years. Because he knew that Peter was now on his way to his house and he had something important to share, he reached out to his relatives, closest friends, and he packed his house with people that he loved and cherished so that they could hear also what Peter had to say. In verse number 28, we're also told that he was a man who knew how to move God. In verse 28, and he said unto them, Ye know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation, but God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Therefore came I unto you without gainsaying, as soon as I was sent for. I asked therefore, for what intent ye have sent for me? And Cornelius said, now listen to this man. 4 days ago, I was fasting until this hour. And at the 9th hour I prayed in my house, and behold, a man stood before me in bright clothing, and said, Cornelius, thy prayer is heard, and thine alms are had in remembrance in the sight of God. Just to help you understand what kind of a man Cornelius was, let me ask you this. How many Christians do you know who have learned the value of not just praying, but fasting as well? One of the most common comments that we get from our college students when they send back word on a particular college course that they've taken, it's usually associated with the course on fasting. These individuals write letters and they say, I grew up in a Baptist church. I grew up in a Christian home. I have heard hundreds, perhaps thousands of sermons. But this course on fasting blew me away. I have never heard sermons about fasting as was in this course. I've never read so much about fasting in my life. And then comes the clincher. Most of them say, and I have never personally fasted. But after finishing this course, I started fasting, and I have been shocked to see what God has done for me in relation to the matter of fasting. Cornelius did not grow up in a Baptist church. Cornelius somehow came across this doctrine of fasting, and he combined it with prayer, and he viewed it as a sacrifice on his part that was pleasing to God. But keep in mind, he was not a Jew like Peter. He wasn't a Baptist like you and I. He was a Roman soldier who faithfully served Caesar, and yet he was so interested in pleasing God that he was willing to give up food as a means of trying to get closer to God. I wonder how many people here this morning have chosen deliberately to give up eating food for 24 hours or more for spiritual reasons. But he was a Roman soldier. My point is, he was not your ordinary, typical Roman or Jew. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, there was a truth that most people either miss or they don't want to have anything to do with it. And the Lord is wanting us to see something in this matter of Cornelius. I think it's kind of a shocking thing. And that is, he was a good man who was lost. All of these good qualities. This man who stood out above the others, head and shoulders. This man whose lifestyle put Jews to shame. If you were to read Acts chapter 11, you would probably start getting bored almost immediately, because it is nothing more than Peter telling and repeating himself by and large. Because when he got done with this visit, he went back home, and boy, they got on him big time. What are you doing going into the house of a Gentile? What are you doing talking to a Roman? What are you doing spending time and fellowshipping, we heard, with a Roman soldier? But instead of it being an exact duplication of what we're told in chapter 10, there's one thing that is added in this chapter that is so critical to this story. And it all has to do with what the angel who appeared to Cornelius told him. Look at verse 13. Acts chapter 11, verse 13. And he showed us how he had seen an angel in his house, which stood and said unto him, Send men to Joppa and call for Simon, whose surname is Peter, who shall tell thee words whereby thou and all thy house shall be saved.
Amen.
You may want to circle that word thou, because the angel informed Cornelius that Simon Peter was going to tell him and whoever happened to be in that house how they could be saved. But wait a minute. He was willing to be different from the rest of his own people because of his religious views. And so are the Amish.
Right, that's true.
They're willing to look quite different. They're willing to live quite different.
Right.
You will not find a more sincere group of people on earth. Cornelius was willing to be different, but he was still lost.
Right.
The Bible tells us that he was a devout man, spiritually minded, always thinking of the religious slant or impact. And yet there are a lot of sincere Catholics, and yet many of them are lost as well.
Right.
The Bible tells us that he was a God-fearing man. He wanted to please God, and he was hurt when he fell short. And there are a lot of lost people who are afraid of God, who want to please him, but they don't know how. They're always reaching out for him in a way. They're always wanting to please him, but again, there's a disconnect. And the reason is because they're not saved. The Holy Spirit also tells us that he was generous. Always giving money to the poor, but you know what? The Pharisees did the same thing. Their hearts were not as tender, perhaps, but the Pharisees were very generous. They just liked to announce their generosity. The Bible also tells us that he was a man of prayer. And you'll find stories of holy men in India who meditate for hours or days on end, and sometimes with a stretched out arm just to show how sincere they really are. Cornelius was a man who diligently practiced instant obedience. He was given an order. That order was considered done as far as he was concerned because he knew that he would fulfill it. But so did a lot of soldiers. When in combat, and they were ordered to their death. And they followed those orders knowing that they would die. He was a man who willingly sacrificed, and he fasted and prayed on numerous occasions because he believed that it would both please God and help himself to become a better kind of person. But in spite of this long list of admirable qualities, he was informed by the angel who paid him a visit that he was lost. And that is the crucial and most important message of all in these two chapters. For Peter, he needed to know that all Jews are no longer forbidden from eating things. God had now cleansed these things. He had removed the restriction. Jews were now to live like Christians as they got saved. Dietary restrictions were done away with. And for Peter, he needed to know that there was now no distinction between Jew or Gentile in the matter of salvation. And for Peter, he also needed to know that most of this world is convinced in their own minds they are basically a good person.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Most people have this idea that there's a gigantic pair of scales up in heaven. And God will put all of the good things of their life compared with the bad. And if the good outweighs the bad, and most people think they'll be okay because they're basically good. Cornelius had most people beat by a mile. He was religious, devout, always thinking about God. He was willing to fast. He was willing to pray. He saw a person who was down and out. He reached out to them and helped them. You could not find a man who was any better as far as his deeds or behavior goes. The average person, they know they're not perfect, but who is? The average person, they know that they could always do better, but who can? But God's message to one and all, including every church member and visitor here this morning, is if a man who was as good as Cornelius was lost, what about you?
The preacher.
I'm not trying to get a saved person re-saved. The truth of the matter is, I'm not trying to accomplish anything but just to preach this sermon. But I can remember years ago when I first got into a Baptist church, an evangelist and his wife came to visit our church. This evangelist had preached a number of times. His wife had spoken to the ladies several times. And this evangelist's wife had a very interesting testimony because she talked about how many people she had won to Christ. She talked about all of the things that she did in her Christian life, only to come to the place where she realized that she had never been saved. She had won something like 300 people to Christ as a lost person. A lost person is capable of doing a lot of good. And again, that's why I think this is one truth that is so hard and difficult for people to fathom. Because we can look at individuals and their lives are admirable. We can look at people who are doing better things than we are. We can look at individuals who kind of make us feel bad. We get convicted just being around them. And yet the angel's message to Cornelius was, you're lost. You need to be saved. And the message for him was not lost. And Cornelius became an even better man when he became a saved man. Let's bow for